Okay, this is Bad Faith in Politics, Part 2. Please listen to the first one first so that you can follow where this is going. So, as I said in the last segment, the libertarian ideology, because people can choose the preferences within it, seems to have a glaring hole in it as a universal philosophy that it presents itself as, a sort of a hole where the morality should be. And within that hole, you can smuggle a different ideology, like white supremacy or fascism. So the priorities within the ideology are determined by this inner smuggled Trojan horse of an ideology. And that sort of separates between left and right libertarianism, and it also presents the ability to use libertarianism just to cloak this inner ideology. And there have been some people who clearly were doing that. For example, Ron Paul may be one of them, and or Rand Paul to the extent he's a libertarian, but he adds probably some of that populism that has become the new fashion, which again might be on purpose kind of following from the pseudo libertarianism into a half libertarian, half populist version, which is even better for allowing the white supremacy to come through. But you can see it also like in Hans Hermann Hoppe of the Austrian school. And in fact, there are many. I mentioned in the last one about the John Birch Society, and in the UK, the Nigel Farage and his party, UKIP, which is the UK Independence Party, and was very anti-Europe and quite racist. So I was sort of too innocent or naive to realize this at first, and just believed everyone who espoused the ideology really believed it. But when I did see like Hoppy or the Ron Paul newsletters, I saw that there might be some bad actors, but I thought there were just a few. But I'm not so sure about that anymore, because when Trump happened, well, the people who I knew and trusted the most in the libertarian circles were anti-Trump, and certainly could see the problems and occasionally even spoke out against him. But there were far too many libertarians who went along with the GOP and even with Trump, for me to believe that it's just a small wing of libertarians who are bad faith actors. I think it's actually used quite a lot on the libertarian right to cloak something else, generally a kind of white supremacist attitude. There's a great video that discusses a lot of this, primarily talking about politicians who use and abuse the libertarian ideology in this way. And it's called Matt Gaetz is a Monster. Now, of course, no true libertarian would say that Gaetz is one, and he himself says he's just part libertarian, part populist, which is an absurd ideology, but it allows him to abuse both of them for his ends, for different ends, in order to achieve his entire agenda, which is a very much a white supremacist agenda, which you can see in this video. It's called Matt Gaetz is a Monster, as by Renegade Cut on YouTube, and it really talks about a lot of what I'm talking about today, but only talks about Matt Gaetz primarily and other GOP politicians. But libertarianism was used to reduce faith in government, as I said in the last video. They would call for reducing taxes and cutting all social spending. Not cutting it to zero, at least not unless you're Ron Paul, but not increasing it. No new social programs, and a reduction in them going forward, as you know, compared to inflation and so forth. And so there were still taxes being levied, but they were all being used on the military. And libertarians would reply that the military is one of the core functions of government, along with policing and incarceration, which were also expanded. So the regular person still paid quite a bit in taxes during, for example, the Reagan administration, but never received anything back from it. All that their money was used for was killing people overseas and incarcerating people at home. And so people would spend this money and get nothing from it, and see a lot of negative things in society, including the incarceration of black people. And the only people who really like that are probably people who want to see black people locked up, which comes down to white supremacy, which I think there's a great source for understanding white supremacy and its appeal. Okay, and it has to be smuggled in under the guise of libertarianism, so people certainly don't want to admit it, but it's got some underlying appeal for some portion of white people. So the author, Ajoma Aluo, she's the author of Mediocre. She writes, white supremacy is a pyramid scheme. And basically what she's saying is that white men were taught that if they support certain politicians, they will get to stay on top in society. In other words, they would always be better off than blacks and women. So even if they're just a sort of mediocre talent or skill, they will do fine in society. They don't need special talent or to work extra hard and earn great skills. It's a little bit like a safety net, and it's the only safety net because the same politicians will be cutting the safety net that actually helps out the people at the bottom. And these voters expect a booming economy from the politicians. They've been promised that, and they expect to be fairly near the top of it because they'll be above blacks and women. But, of course, the economy doesn't boom that much with these politicians, and there are many underemployed people because they lack a good starting point or safety net with which to bounce back and find a job that matches their skills and abilities very well. So, and there's deep inequality, which also doesn't help, and some corporate rent seeking. So the economy is not that great, and so when these voters are suddenly not doing so well, and they have no actual safety net, because the politicians were against that, they end up quite angry. They're not doing well in the pyramid scheme. The people who are doing well are the ones above them. So this ends up stoking the anger that, for example, you saw on January 6th, which is a white supremacist-led insurrection trying to install Trump as a fascist dictator. The siege it wasn't about fighting social inequities. It was about supplanting the government to further cement those inequities. And that's pretty much a quote from Liu Kang, who is quoted in this video by Ajoma Aluo, who wrote Mediocre. So we have to understand what it truly was and why. See, these angry, poor white men were angry at blacks and women who they thought they should be doing better than, and they were angry they weren't doing well enough. And they pointed this anger at the blacks and the women rather than the politicians who, with their allies in media, tried to sow the division and make sure that the anger was pointed in that direction so they could avoid blame and avoid dealing with reality. Okay, so that's the pyramid scheme. But now let's come back and look again at what we just saw about why the people got angry. They paid a lot in taxes and they got nothing in return from government. But instead of getting angry at government, they got angry at the people who they thought they were supposed to be doing better than, because they're worried that those people are the competition. They've been taught that those people would be taking away their money and their jobs, like a zero-sum game. But what are the taxes being used for? This is the part that the people aren't really looking at, and they're saying, well, it's the function of government to do police and military. But what are the police and military doing? The police are locking up black people, and the military are going overseas and killing people who are different, the Muslims or whoever overseas. So again, it's white supremacist. That's what the function of government is actually doing, is oppressing those black people, which the white people are hoping will help them, criminalizing them, putting them in jail, in prison, so they have a hard time getting jobs after and voting after. And of course, going overseas and taking the oil from the people over there, which again, the white people are hoping they'll bring home the oil and keep gas prices low. So they're hoping to get something from it. But like any pyramid scheme, they really don't end up doing very well. And again, it's not a zero-sum game. And so everyone could be better off if actually everyone had rights, because that's the way to have a booming economy. That's what a true libertarian would realize, or an Austrian economist would realize. When everyone has rights, when everyone has freedoms, when everyone has an equal footing and an ability to compete with each other, that's when the economy can really take off and really boom. And of course, that's just the economic side. If you truly care about rights, individual rights, then of course you should be caring about all individual rights. So it's not true libertarianism that would put something like this into place. It's white supremacy. Now, the oldest abuse of a libertarian argument for the cover for white supremacy is, of course, states' rights. So, decentralization of power, they argue, and, your whole federalism and so on. But what is your priority, states' rights or civil rights? Decentralization is great, but not if it creates smaller tyrannies and people lose their fundamental rights that libertarians claim to hold as central. A central part of the ideology, individual rights, liberty, individualism. So any libertarians who are against the Voting Rights Act or the civil rights legislation isn't really libertarian, because basic fundamental libertarian rights of the individual must exist across the entire space upon which the democratic ability to extend them is possible, or you're not choosing libertarianism. You're voluntarily giving up libertarianism in favor of a decentralized tyranny. Only once the basic rights, individual rights, are guaranteed can you then look to decentralizing, right? It's a matter of priorities again. And if you don't protect those basic fundamental rights and choose instead to prioritize decentralizing, then you have what we started out with, which is a decentralization that allowed for slavery as a state's right. And so if you put that state's right ahead, you might not get slavery back, but we got several other more subtle versions of a similar kind of oppression, like the worst of the Jim Crow laws, the lynching, and other murder of black people. Today, the criminalization of black people, the incarceration at massive rates, stopping and searching and oftentimes shooting black people for going through a red light at the tail end or not having a tail light. The destruction of civil, human, individual rights because we don't protect them at the federal level. The federal government has been the one to protect civil rights ever since the Civil War, and has been a progressive force generally, helping to readjust things after slavery ended, helping to make it possible for black people to end up holding office until the Jim Crow laws came in at the state level and prevented it. The federal government was the one that allowed for black people to be able to vote by getting rid of the Jim Crow laws until that has been turned back and the GOP has tried to give it back to the states, right? It's the federal government that has been protecting rights. So when you go with the party that wants to allow the states to cut off these rights, you're saying that you care more about a certain decentralization just to the state level, not even decentralized to a local level, but the decentralization to a state level is more important than the basic fundamental rights that are supposed to be the central core of libertarianism, upon which everything else is founded. Now, the more progressive policies, especially ones that specifically help those at the bottom, and this even includes voting rights, it doesn't have to be redistribution of income, it can simply be voting rights that help people who are assumed to be poor. Well, they tend to help black people more. Why? Because black people have not been able to accumulate the kind of wealth that white people have. First, starting out with slavery and not being able to accumulate after that, and then getting slapped down again by the types of laws that allowed institutionalized racism, such as segregation, and other kinds of policies that allowed discrimination against black people at work. And then when they did accumulate wealth, things like the Black Wall Street Massacre occurred that took it back away again. So all the way through even the modern times, it has been very hard for black people, black families to accumulate wealth and, of course, to pass it on the way that white people have been able to pass on their wealth with very little taxation of inheritance. So, for all of these reasons, an ideology like the ideology of the more right-leaning libertarianism, an ideology that goes against the federal government and instead for state rights, and against progressive policies, and for the smallest federal government possible, is a great cover for white supremacists. Now, you might say, but come on, true libertarians would be against these kinds of progressive policies anyway, right? And that may be true, but think about this. They justify being more against personal welfare than corporate welfare. So is this because of problems with socialism, calculation problems, or how about marginal tax rates and incentives? Well, corporate welfare is likely more dangerous based on planning concerns like calculation and knowledge problems. And they have incentives and marginal tax rates too. If libertarians are willing to give it the attention it deserves, they would likely see that the priority should be on reducing corporate welfare and power and making it easier to compete as a small business against corporations by evening the playing field, rather than trying to cut welfare programs and things that help out people at the bottom or help people transition from one job to another and get retrained and so forth. Yeah? So you can say, sure, but we should privatize it all and it would be better, but really, should that really be the priority? We could bring in a lot more tax revenue from corporations actually having to pay a bit of tax and evening it out against the small businesses, and then use that so that we can actually reduce taxes on the middle class. And we wouldn't necessarily have to expand the programs that much, but certainly stop cutting them in real terms and provide a bit more of a safety net using some of the taxes that we get from corporations. But especially the right-leaning libertarians would never consider this. And even for a moment, consider Medicare for all. One of the scary things from the Democrats that justify libertarians voting for the GOP, despite all the things that I've named about the GOP and why they're very unlibertarian. So Medicare for all, it would obviously be a replacement for Obamacare. And as libertarians have to no end told us during the Obama years, Obamacare is a big boondoggle for corporations in the healthcare industry and in related industries. In fact, this is one of the few boondoggles for corporations, for rent-seeking for corporations, that the GOP actually seemed to prioritize getting rid of. And it just happens to be also the one that also provides something for the low income and helps people out with a safety net. There are so many massive handouts that Obamacare gives to create monopolies in the healthcare industry, to provide favors to specific monopolies that they create, and to essentially just massively bureaucratize the whole healthcare industry and create massive amounts of waste and rents to these companies. So if we're replacing that with a public program called Medicare for All, would it actually be worse? Or could it actually in some ways be better for markets to allow the competition of private companies for contracts with this single government agency, which is handling an industry which has many problems when it's based around profit? Because unlike many other industries, it should not be based around profit. Doctors need to make a decision based on who needs the help more, who is more likely to die if they don't get immediate help. It's called triage. And unlike most other industries, the profit central motivation would mess up the ability of doctors to do their jobs because it needs to be based around triage. And so demanding that a customer pay, even if it's through insurance, can destroy that. And that actually leads to lives lost. So I would argue that from a moral, a practical, and a generally libertarian efficiency perspective, Medicare for All would actually potentially be better than Obamacare for all of these many reasons and in these many ways, allowing smaller companies to compete for contracts and to serve the people better instead of having the massive corporate handouts that Obamacare gives to monopolies in the healthcare industry right now. But many libertarians do not want to consider this. Why? Whether it's for their own gain, because they want lower taxes and greater shareholder wealth, or whether it's to keep the power and privilege of being white and hold those down at the bottom. It seems that their preferences for party of choice and their priorities actually does uphold this white supremacist and pro-business but not free market policies. And that seems to be why they choose to vote Republican and not Democrat. And whether it's being done on purpose or not, as an active measures campaign by, Putin in Russia, then, working with people in America to push this kind of fascist authoritarian line. And that's why they undermine institutions, undermine faith in government, and then push a white supremacist line. Or whether it's all entirely happening because individuals want lower taxes and profit and personal power. Well, whatever the reason, they use libertarian ideology to undermine faith in government, get people on board with defunding at first until people could only see it as hopeless and useless. And once that was a success, they could open the way to move to a populism, an ideology that allows them to divide, confuse, to create a post-truth world in which institutions of all sorts are broken and despised, and people cheer on a post-truth demagogue like Trump. But thankfully, with the election of Joe Biden, we have reversed this trend for now, but we must work to ensure that we don't return to that ugly place, which puts America as a free country in peril. Those are my thoughts. I would love to hear yours in the comments. Please ask me questions and share your thoughts. Thanks.